I'm Eleanor Harvey. I'm the curator of the exhibition Alexander von Humboldt and the United States, Art, Nature, and Culture. And it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce you to this amazing man, this amazing exhibition, and the journey that we're going to take through early American art and history. The gentleman that you see over here is Alexander von Humboldt. He was a German naturalist who basically was one of the most widely recognized and admired men alive during the 19th century. But we wanted you to see his friends, Thomas Jefferson, the people who admired him, Frederick Douglass, the people who were inspired by him, Carl Sagan, Rachel Carson, Teddy Roosevelt, John Muir, all of the things that are named for Humboldt in this country as an act of homage to a man who was one of the most widely and profoundly admired men of the 19th century. He wrote over 30 books. He corresponded with over 20,000 individuals. He said he slept 4 hours a night. He called coffee concentrated sunbeams. And he came up with what was then a radical idea that all of nature was interconnected, that what happens in the Alps could predict what you saw in the Andes and what you might see in the Rocky Mountains, that climate was global and not local, and that where you found plants and what altitude you found them could tell you a lot about the local ecosystem. It's a concept we pretty much take for granted these days, but at the time, it was a new way to think. And Humboldt spent 50 years amassing the data from around the globe that would let him put together something he called the web of life, or the unity of nature. So what does any of this have to do with American art and culture? Well, in 1804, after spending 5 years traveling through South America and Mexico, Humboldt was on his way home, and he made a pit stop in Cuba in order to assemble all of his belongings. And the American consul said, "You love the concept of the United States. You think American democracy could be a model for the future. You want to meet Thomas Jefferson, who's the president. You're this close. Why would you leave now?" And he convinces him to take a detour. And so for 6 weeks, Humboldt will be in Philadelphia and Washington, hanging around with some of the leading artists, men of science, and politicians, and it will shape the course of our history for the next 50 years. This is basically how old Humboldt was when we first met him. He looks happy in his environment. His favorite barometer is down here in the left corner. He's pressing plants in his travel journals, and he's looking at you with that kind of Mona Lisa smile that says, "I am having the world's best time, and you should follow me." And so we did. When he first arrives in the United States, he's a little worried that he's not important enough for the president to pay attention to him. And so he writes him a letter, which we have here, in which he explains, "I love the Declaration of Independence. I have read your notes on the state of Virginia. And oh, by the way, you have this thing about mammoths? So do I. I found mammoth teeth in the Andes. Can I come visit?" Well, Jefferson has been tipped off by the consul. You really want to meet this guy because in addition to his being charismatic and wonderful and really interesting, he spent the last year in Mexico creating the most detailed map of North America that is going to change the way we negotiate with the King of Spain after the Louisiana Purchase. So Jefferson has an agenda, Humboldt has an agenda, and the two men forge a friendship that will last the rest of Jefferson's life. So this is the thing that brought them together when you get right down to it. This is the first, most complete skeleton of a mastodon. They thought it was a mammoth, and I'll explain a little bit about that later. But this was dug up in upstate New York, installed in Charles Wilson Peele's museum in Philadelphia. And this is the creature that literally helps bring Jefferson, Humboldt, and American art and culture all together. So let's figure out how that works. If you walk into this first room, it really is about those 6 weeks in the United States. This is Splashdown. This is where Humboldt meets Jefferson. And this is the relative ages at which they are when they meet. This is Humboldt at age 35. It is Jefferson at age 65, both painted by members of the Peale family, sort of America's first family of artists. And so this is the relationship that will energize the way we think about exploration, the way we think about nature, and the way we think about our national standing on the international stage. So I mentioned the map. This is it. Well, rather, this is the copy we made of it. This is Humboldt's map of Mexico, Texas, the southwestern United States, Baja California. If you zoom in, you'll find Santa Fe up here, the location of the Comanche Indian tribes, and most important for us, this is the biggest geopolitical gift we could have been given at this time. Spain is furious that Napoleon has sold Louisiana to these upstart Americans rather than back to them. So now Jefferson is negotiating with a very annoyed king of Spain over what is the new border between our two countries. Spain is arguing for the Sabine River, which divides Louisiana from Texas in modern geography. Humboldt's like, no. I think what you really want is the Rio Grande. And that will set up the tension that won't really be solved until after the 1846-48 war with Mexico, when we completely reset the border. But what Jefferson has been asking is, what's going on in here? Who lives there? Is there agriculture? Are there mountains? Are there rivers? And Humboldt's like, oh, well, I'm happy to share. Even though he is traveling on a Spanish passport under the good graces of the King of Spain, Humboldt believes knowledge should be shared by everyone. And he is willing to give us a 6-year head start on a map that he will eventually publish. I'm sure the King of Spain wasn't particularly pleased about that, but Humboldt was. And that's really the important thing, which is he's on our side. He's in our corner. He wants us to succeed. He is looking for a new style of government that is not monarchy and colonialism. And what he desperately wants is for America to live up to its ideals. And those are the ideals, of course, as written by Jefferson himself in the Declaration of Independence. So when Humboldt shows up on the Philadelphia docks, the man who rescues him and takes him under his wing is Charles Willson Peale. He is the patriarch of the Peale family of artists. This is his museum, the first one in the United States. He is welcoming you into a place that is a combination of art and natural history and a civics lesson. He believes that what we have here will help people develop pride in their own country. So, for instance, the top portraits are all of the great American statesmen. That is George Washington in the upper left, not coincidentally, right over the case that has the bald eagle, the national bird. I wonder if it's a little bit of a dig that it's poor Ben Franklin's turkey that is awaiting taxidermy down here in the lower left corner before it ends up joining all of the rest of the specimens. And of course, behind Peale himself is that mastodon skeleton, tucked behind there. And that is the artifact that helped put us really in the public eye in Europe as well as America. Now, in 1801, when this mastodon skeleton is excavated, it is considered the largest terrestrial being. We're a good 30 years away from really understanding dinosaurs at this point, so we're not going to get into the technicalities of Sue the T-Rex. Right now, it's the mammoth. And so mammoth everything becomes like the adjective for the United States. In 1802, the town of Leicester, Massachusetts makes a 15-foot wide wheel of cheese called the Mammoth Cheese, which they put on a flatbed cart and, on horses, bring it down to Washington to deliver to the mammoth in chief, which is Jefferson. Someone else makes a loaf of bread the size of a casket called the mammoth bread. There is a mammoth pickle, which is a 9-pound beet. There's a mammoth egg eating contest, which reminds me a little of Cool Hand Luke. And what you have is this kind of celebration of the mammoth as the scale and scope of our cultural ambitions. From our president, to our foods, to our manufacturing, to our prospects. Send Lewis and Clark out west, and what you're going to come back with are new mammoth features, whether it's Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, or whether it is in fact the mammoth bones that will come out of the Big Bone Lick along the Kentucky-Ohio border. Every time we go further west, we come back with bigger, greater, more impressive landmarks, whether it's the Great Plains, Yellowstone, Yosemite, the Grand Canyon, and you begin to see how the mammoth itself sets the tone for the scale of the features that will eventually become our national monuments. So at the time that Humboldt is here, we are all still waiting. Lewis and Clark have just left. In fact, Humboldt's a little upset that he missed them because now he really wants to chase after them. He's not convinced their instruments are as good as his. And now he thinks, I have to go redo what they're doing and they haven't even gotten back yet. So he keeps saying this country that stretches west of these mountains presents a vast area to conquer for science. And what he is saying to us is, you can't build your way to the top of the hierarchy in Europe. The seven wonders of the world, all those architectural monuments that are the product of millennia of human ambition, it's like you're way behind on that. What you have is nature. What you have is everything west of these mountains. What you can contribute to science is what's going to put you on the map. Play to your strengths, go with what's already here. So for a while, it is the mammoth. And in fact, Peale will come out of retirement in order, he's sort of galvanized by Humboldt's visit. He'll come out of retirement and he says, I think I've got one more great history painting in me, and that's this. It is the exhumation of the mastodon. This is Peale's painting where he shows himself and his family and his entourage and the American Philosophical Society and all of the workers excavating the bones from that pit in upstate New York. Now, it filled in with water. You can see there are thunderstorms going on in the background. It's a marl pit, which is kind of like a peat bog. So it's acidic and it's goopy, but it is farmland if you can get this stuff out of the way. And so here is John Maston, the farmer, on this ladder. You see right behind him there is a shirtless worker who is holding up one of the lower leg bones, and Peale has his template with that lower leg bone so that he's confirming what they're bringing out of the pit. If you look near the water wheel, you can see teeth and other small bones as they begin to literally excavate American identity out of the primordial ooze. What I love about this painting is, for students of American painting, the Hudson River School, the idea that landscape conveys our national mandate, it starts here. 20 years before Thomas Cole will start painting in the Catskills, we have a Catskill mountain landscape with a thunderstorm and literally this American history moment going on. It's a magnificent picture, and it really, I think, says a great deal about the way that Peale sees himself at the center of all of this. So if this is the first mastodon skeleton that's been put together, how the heck do you know what you're doing? What Peale assumed, correctly as it turns out, is its closest modern relative is an elephant. So his son Rembrandt creates a pen and ink drawing based on a French engraving of an elephant skeleton. And so this is what they're using as they're bringing bones out of the muck. They are holding them up against a template going, where does this one go? So to me, it's like the IKEA instruction manual, and all you really need is the Allen wrench, because here you've got scapula, humerus, radius, ulna. They're all marked just the way they would if you were opening the box to put something together. The fact that Peale was able to do this, and he's the first to do this, is something that resonates in the European scientific community and really, I think, establishes our bona fides as a society, new as we are, capable of contributing at the highest level to an international conversation about science. When Peale puts the bones together, his youngest son, Titian, will make a watercolor of the bones, and you'll notice that there are parts that are stippled in. Those were the pieces that were missing, that would have to be fabricated. The top of the head, the tusks, the bottom of the ribs. Now, let's talk a little bit about the skeleton itself, because what Peale is able to do through the beauty of bilateral symmetry is if he has a right scapula intact and he only has a partial left, he knows how to carve the missing piece. And so Moses Williams, his free man of color who works in the museum with Peale, assists with William Rush, who is the leading sculptor in Philadelphia, often does ship's figureheads. He's the one who will sculpt the missing pieces. So if we take a really close look at this collar, this scapula here, you can see that the bottom lobe, you can actually see the wood grain. And there's a peg smack in the middle of it. And then the piece above it is also wood that is literally sort of pieced into this larger curved bone. So when you start paying close attention, you'll begin to see the pegs that hold the skeleton together. The lower parts of the ribs, which didn't survive excavation, they're dovetailed in, and the bottoms are wood capped in metal. The upper part of the cranium is soft, like a baby's skull, all throughout the mammoth's life, because if it were solid bone, the chances are it would be too heavy for the mammoth to lift. So it stays spongy. They don't tend to survive excavation as often, but Peale was able to find in a different dig the top of the skull. Rather than mix and match in good modern scientific authenticity, he kept his digs separate and simply made the copies that he needed in order to complete this. The tusks came out of the marl pit, but then crumbled, again because of the acidity of the soil. And so they knew they were roughly 5 feet long. They knew roughly how they were curved, but they had to fabricate them. And again, as a matter of weight, they are papier mâché. And that is not unusual for skeletons like this. The ones that use real tusks often have crutch-like armatures down below them to keep them from simply falling out of the sockets. There's really nothing to hold them on. So the way I think about this skeleton, it's the largest mixed media sculpture in an American art museum at the earliest possible date. This is Peale's artistic and scientific rendering of what to do with those bones, how to sculpt the missing pieces, and how to give us back the very first natural monument, if you will, around which to construct our identity, or at least our sense of ourselves. So this went on view Christmas Eve in 1801, ushers in the year of the mammoth in 1802. Humboldt arrives in 1804 going, let's talk mammoths. And in fact, the week before Humboldt will leave for Europe, Peale will host a dinner for him in the Mammoth Room at his museum, and the tables will be set around and underneath the mastodon. And Humboldt is feted underneath the creature that he helped elevate as part of who we think we are. So when Peale takes him around Philadelphia, he introduces him to the scientific community, the American Philosophical Society, which makes him a member as he is departing for Europe. When he comes to Washington, it's Peale who sets up the trip with Jefferson. And so Humboldt will spend 2.5 weeks in Washington, D.C., palling around with Jefferson, Secretary of State James Madison, and Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin. They will pore over maps. They will swap stories about exploration and science. They will say mean things about Napoleon because nobody really likes him, and that's the competition that Humboldt endures his entire life because he and Napoleon are born the same year, and Napoleon is really ticked off that Humboldt is more popular than he is. So it sets up this magnificent tension in Paris that Jefferson will end up being tangentially involved in. So what we have is Jefferson being able to say to Humboldt, we value the fact that what you're planning to do in the sciences will take American data and fold it into your larger rubric about how all nature and the entire world is interconnected. What Humboldt most wants from us is to live up to our ideals. He wants us to be that nation where all men are created equal. He wants us to be the avatar for all societies that are unhappy with monarchical or imperial rule, to have democracy, take its place. He will become an increasingly revolutionary man in Europe between the time he meets Jefferson and the 1848 European revolutions. It kind of starts here. So when Humboldt leaves, we're all kind of exhilarated. We're waiting for Lewis and Clark to get back. We can't wait to see what they bring back from those, west of those mountains. Now, poor Lewis and Clark have no clue that Humboldt has been here. And so when they get back, here is Jefferson, who's like, well, what about this, and what about that, and what about the other, and did you measure this, and did you measure that? And I can imagine Meriwether Lewis turning and going, that wasn't in the instructions. What Lewis and Clark come back to is the genuine excitement of what they did bring back, but also the sense that somehow they might have fallen short because Humboldt changed the calculus. Humboldt raised the expectations. And now what Jefferson wants more than anything else is to be able to feed Humboldt the caliber and the quantity of the data that Humboldt is so enthusiastic about. So that's where we are in 1804, 1805. We are exhilarated, we're euphoric, we have tied our history and our sense of future to the scale of the mammoth. Now, what happens when Georges Cuvier, the leading scientist in Paris, who is comparing mammoth bones from Siberia to the ones in North America, he's teasing out that there's a difference between a mammoth and a mastodon. I have called this a mammoth so far because that's what Jefferson and Humboldt thought it was when they met. It is a mastodon. And when Cuvier delivers the news, congratulations, you have a mastodon, Jefferson's not that thrilled because what he realizes is it means it's extinct. And it's a little hard to build your national identity around something that no longer exists. And in fact, the leading European scientist, the Comte de Buffon, who thinks that we are less than and degenerate than Europe on principle, says, well, if it had been that great, it wouldn't have died out. And so Jefferson is now sort of on the horns of a different dilemma. How do you keep the sense of the mammoth when you can't really use the mammoth or the mastodon as your imprimatur? So what you do is you go back to Humboldt and Humboldt's discussion about natural monuments. And the two natural monuments that we adopt first come straight out of Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, straight out of Humboldt's early writings, and they are Natural Bridge and Niagara Falls. Natural Bridge in Jefferson's home state of Virginia, considered the largest arch of its kind at the time. It was actually the land and the arch were owned by Jefferson at the time. And so this is a painting in which Jefferson has put a great deal of stock. It is large, it is impressive, it's sublime, it gives you a headache when you lean over. And what's even better is patriotic. You'll notice the black man in the foreground here. That is Patrick Henry, who was a free man of color living there at the time that Jefferson owned this property, kind of the absentee landlord and the local tour guide. And what he is pointing to up the left-hand side of the arch are George Washington's initials, presumably scratched into the rock 23 feet up the side when he surveyed this feature for Lord Rockbridge in the 1750s. So this is a historically resonant landscape that folds in George Washington, the founding of the nation, nature as an avatar, Jefferson as president. And so when Humboldt writes about the natural bridges in South America, he specifically and explicitly mentions Jefferson by name and says, this is an arch similar to the one owned by, that great savant in the United States, the third president, Thomas Jefferson. He is deliberately wrapping us into his narrative. In fact, one of my favorite anecdotes is when Jefferson writes to the artist John Trumbull and says, I really want you to take a detour, come to Natural Bridge before some European artist comes here and bungles it. So he's clearly looking for American artists to end up creating the icon for an American landmark. For Niagara Falls, 800 miles away in upstate New York, the cataract is an impressive site. It becomes a pilgrimage site shortly after Humboldt's visit. And Humboldt, again, when he writes about the Falls of Tequendama on the Bogota River in Colombia, will reference Niagara so that you understand that Tequendama is a vertical fall and that Niagara is a horizontal fall, but he will compare the cubic feet of water that are going over the rim at any given moment. And again, bringing us into parallel with the other wonders of around the world, specifically in the Americas. So how do we know that these two features become the next avatars of American ambition? In 1825, Henry S. Tanner creates the map that uses Humboldt's information, all of this detailed information way down into Mexico, but it's the cartouche. Cartouches on maps are kind of a Cliff Notes way of understanding what the culture cares about. And most European maps, the cartouche will be the cityscape, it will be a landmark, usually a man-made landmark. It's a way of encapsulating what it is we want you to care about. So what do we do as the cartouche? We take Natural Bridge and Niagara Falls and scooch the 800 miles together so that it looks like it's the Niagara River that is running underneath Natural Bridge, so that our two major natural monuments are functioning as one element in the American landscape. I find that very telling. I think the idea that we would deliberately do that, knowing, as a cartographer does, that Niagara Falls is up here and Natural Bridge is down here, that idea is more important than picking one of them and making it the topographical centerpiece. So from there, what we also understand is there are an enormous number of paintings and drawings and engravings of Natural Bridge and Niagara Falls. If you just look at the sheer numbers done by, hundreds of artists, you begin to understand that these are the places that have traction, they have an audience, and there's a certain amount of civic pride that comes through nature rather than, again, anything that we are building on it. So the artist that Humboldt deeply inspires after the Peels is Frederick Church. He is our leading landscape painter. He is the artist who created both this version of Natural Bridge and that version of Niagara Falls. And I thought that was important, that the artist who is called the American Humboldt by one of the art critics of the day recognized in his own lifetime how much he owed to Humboldt. And when Humboldt says, as we've put up on the wall, nature and art are clearly united in my work, what he is really saying is scientists need to maintain an aesthetic appreciation of the world around them. What's the point if you can't feel wonder? But artists need to know enough science to do justice to their subjects. And Church really runs with that his entire career, not just when he goes to South America, inspired by Humboldt, but when he is at Niagara Falls or Natural Bridge or anywhere else that he goes in his career. Humboldt infuses Church's working practice. Church had the luxury of growing up on Humboldt's writings. Humboldt begins publishing in English in 1811 with Views of the Cordilleras, and by the time Church is born in the 1820s and becomes an artist in the 1840s, Humboldt is something he is steeped in. So Church, who will not go west of the Mississippi, will delay any trip to Europe. His two major trips early in his career outside of the United States are to South America, and they are both inspired directly by Humboldt. So there aren't really guidebooks to South America at this point. It is still part and parcel a very foreign place to get to. So he's using Humboldt's books. And he's specifically using Views of the Cordilleras with one of the best typographical title pages I have ever seen in a 19th century volume. And what he's doing is he is reading Humboldt at night and then literally kind of reenacting his hikes and his trips the next day. So we're dealing with a fanboy. We are dealing with a guy who is on the Humboldt reunion tour. Humboldt's there in the early 1800s, Church is there in the early 1850s, and literally they are following in his footsteps, staying in the same haciendas that Humboldt did. This is the hacienda owned by one of Humboldt's traveling companions, Carlos Montefar from Ecuador, there in the valley close to Cotopaxi and this little vent called the Head of the Inca. You will notice that he's chosen exactly the same vantage point as showed up on the frontispiece here. It's as though he simply took that little vignette and then expanded the view. But he's literally staying in the same places, following the same terrain, sketching and painting the volcanoes in the Andes that Humboldt just adored. So he is giving us a visual record of what it is like to follow in Humboldt's footsteps. Now, how deeply steeped is Church? I can give you a little bit of an idea. This is one of Humboldt's large hand-colored geographical albums. This is what will bankrupt Humboldt, is self-publishing 36 volumes, some of which are elaborate like this one. And you can, Church had access to these volumes through some of his patrons who had copies of these things in their libraries. So Church could actually do his homework before he went to South America and then use the smaller guidebook when he is actually in South America. So what Church does is exactly what Humboldt tells him to do. Large numbers of colored sketches taken from nature in order to be able to commit to memory what it is you're seeing and then decide how you're going to put the pieces together in your large canvases. And what Humboldt understands is art is a combination of direct observation and then thinking about the message you're trying to get across. He is not looking for something that is just scientific illustration. Humboldt wants art, and Church delivers on that. So you get Cayambe with this wonderful cloud bank and the rising moon over here on the right, and Church is going to pull that cloud bank and the rising moon out of a sketch of a totally different volcano in the same area, because what Church understands is all of this is data. This suite of oil sketches and pencil drawings that he does on site, that he brings back to his studio in New York, this is where the imagination fertilizes those sketches and turns them into compositions that are both faithful to the topography, but also imaginative in the way they bring features together. So Church's first really great picture coming out of South America is Tequendama Falls. It is this big vertical. It's an unusual format for the artist. Was his largest painting to date. And it is, in fact, a replica of the journey that Church and Humboldt took fighting their way up the Bogota River to the base of the falls. And in fact, Humboldt writes that he hired 6 locals to use machetes to hack away the foliage so that he could get to the base of the falls. 50 years later, Church does exactly the same thing. Hire 6 guys to hack away the foliage so that he can do his Humboldt climb to the base of the falls. Now, what I love about it is that Church will include things like this blue and yellow macaw, observing us as we are looking. There's this passion vine off to the side. And then the macaw is drawn again from one of Church's oil sketches that was probably done on site. So what Church is doing is he's building up the vocabulary, he's putting together the pieces, and then he will create this scene that is for him an encapsulation of his trip to South America. Now, the critics weren't overwhelmed with Church's ability to paint water at this point. It kind of looks like lace. And so they said, you know, Mr. Church probably shouldn't paint water because he can't. So what do you think Church's reaction to that being a good Humboldtian is? He will go straight to Niagara Falls, he will paint 100 sketches of the water, and then he will paint Niagara, as if to say, oh yeah, watch me. And when he paints Niagara, the critics all say, well, you know, how's he going to outdo himself on that one? At which point, Church pivots to his next great Humboldtian picture, The Heart of the Andes. We did not have the ability to borrow that picture for this exhibition, so what we did was we created a 4.5-minute video tour using high-resolution photography that lets us literally give you an almost 3D swoop and glide tour from the foreground to the Llano in the middle, up the volcanic headlands to the summit of Chimborazo and back down again, in a way you could not have gotten if the painting were here in the galleries. You simply couldn't see that much detail in it. You couldn't get that close to it. You couldn't see the top half of the picture without a ladder as well. And so we like to think that we took a situation where we would have loved to have had the painting, but it gave us the opportunity to explain to you why we wanted that painting in a way that you could really understand. Now, before Church leaves South America for his first trip, I mentioned that he stayed in the Montufar residence. There was a portrait of Humboldt that had been done in 1802 when he was there. Church had it copied by a younger Ecuadorian artist, Rafael Salas, and he brought this back with him from Ecuador and installed it in his studio in New York and eventually in his home, Olana, which was kind of his version of Humboldt's cosmos, really sort of the center of the universe, where every view out of each window is a composed landscape, where he has sculpted the grounds and added a pond and planted trees and created on the top of this hill in Hudson, New York, his own sort of cosmos where everything is interrelated, the grounds, the interior, the exterior, and so the life of the mind and the life in nature come together. And so we borrowed Church's copy of Cosmos. Again, understanding that Church owned a number of Humboldt's books, that they were things that he cherished, he thumbed through, he would mark a passage or two. We know that it was something that really mattered. Now, when Church paints the Heart of the Andes, he is basing it on an infographic that Humboldt had created right after coming back from his trip to the Americas, and that is called his plant geography map, and that's what's in the case here in the middle of the room. It is half watercolor, half data, beautifully engraved, hand-colored, really magnificent. This would have been folded up and placed in a sleeve in the back of his very first book called The Geography of Plants. What he has done is spectacular. You go from sea level to the top of Chimborazo, but all of the Latin plant names in here are shown at the altitude at which Humboldt found them. And the data on the side is temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, altitude, how deep blue the color of the sky was, comparative data from other places, and characteristic plants. This is the template for the unity of nature. If you think about adding in alpine vegetation from Europe, Rocky Mountain vegetation from the United States, you keep adding different ecosystems and you create this gigantic networked picture. It's an extraordinary document, and what Church will do is take that cone of Chimborazo and that kind of 5 different biomes running from sea level to the top of that mountain, and he will incorporate them all in that painting. It is as though that painting is the visualization of this map. And we know there was intentionality behind it, because what Church intended to do was to ship his major painting to Berlin for Humboldt to see. In a cruel twist of fate, Humboldt dies the week that Church finishes the painting. And by the time Church gets the news, he's been making the shipping arrangements and realizes that the Baron will never be able to see this painting. But what he really wanted to do, and the New York Times encapsulated this in their article about it, is he really wanted to show to Humboldt what he had learned from him. It was a way of saying, this is a summary. It's like, I got it. It's like, you've changed my life. You know, here is my thank you, here is my homage, this is my proof of concept, this is my plant geography map. And so the New York Times mourns with him, and even though Church never met him, he said it was kind of like he'd lost his best friend. So the fact that Humboldt, 50 years after his trip to the United States, still has the power to affect us that deeply, I thought spoke to the depth and resonance of what this exhibition could do. But it isn't just about science and landscape painting and nature, because one of the other things Humboldt believed fervently was in the equality of all races and the need for the abolition of slavery and colonialism. He will sort of tackle Jefferson on this point, but he doesn't really want to jeopardize the friendship, so he isn't going to go all in on, boy, you really need to abolish slavery. But he will take every opportunity over the next 50 years to proselytize to everybody else he can find in a desperate attempt to make us a better country. So the next step is to look at Humboldt, the humanitarian.